Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today we're getting into running back rankings for week 8 of the fantasy football season, going through basically every single matchup and ranking my top players on the week. We'll get into the top 30, and then we'll get into some players that have missed out this week. Honestly, after last week and the amount of buys we had for 6+ teams, this week it is a lot more viable. There's so many good options to be able to start this week, especially in some of those guys that you wouldn't typically start week in and week out. So we'll cover all these. There's probably more than just 30 that you could justify starting this week. But again, the ranking should help you with your start-sit decisions heading into this week. Guys, today's video is also brought to you by the STUNT. If you guys haven't had the chance to check them out, it's an all-sports social media app. Put together some of your favorite aspects of all the social media apps you currently have. Made it all about sports. We're live there every Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, answering your start-sit questions. If you have trade questions for me, anything you need to help with your fantasy team in the second half of this season, I'm answering those again in our live room, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern on the STUNT. If you want to go download the app, would greatly appreciate it. The link will be down below in the description, as well in the pinned comments. Let's get into these rankings. First up, and pretty much every week that he is going to be starting, is Christian McCaffrey. Has Cincinnati, not a fantastic matchup, but actually this season still has been pretty solid. They're 26th in EPA against the run and 21st in fantasy points allowed. Not much to say. He's scoring each and every week. There's no reason to not have him one. At 2 is Austin Eckler. Eckler getting the Bears. I think this is a really big time get right spot for this Chargers rushing game, which has not been good this season whatsoever. Apart from the big 50-yard touchdown from Joshua Kelly last week, this team has not been able to run the ball efficiently on a down-to-down basis, and the Bears could give them the chance to do that. They're 24th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position and 22nd in PFF's run defense grade. 3, Breece Hall. Hall getting the Giants. Look, I think this is a massive second half for Breece Hall. If you could go acquire him, I would definitely be looking to do anything I can to do that. He's been very efficient so far this season as he's gotten healthier coming off the ACL surgery. The Giants are a prime matchup, 27th in fantasy points allowed to running backs and 28th in EPA against the run. So definitely a good spot here for Hall to keep things going. 4, Travis Etienne. Etienne getting the Steelers, another great matchup for running backs, 26th in fantasy points allowed to the position. And then as well, they're also 24th in EPA against the run. So good matchup for Etienne. He has not really ceded much of any opportunity to tank Bigsby, and Bigsby hasn't been good when he's been given a few opportunities per game. So Etienne is locked and loaded right now as a top 5 guy rest of season. Kamara comes in at 5. Got a good matchup here with the Colts, who are 29th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position so far this season. They have really struggled. Kamara has also just seen an obscene receiving workload. It's just in the game last week against Jacksonville, it almost felt like a detriment to the team how much they were getting Kamara the ball in the receiving game as opposed to using these other weapons. As long as that continues, he's the go-to guy here for Derek Carr. He's going to probably see, even with the time that he missed, he could still get to like 60, 70 receptions this season. So moving forward in half PPR, full PPR formats, he's going to be a top 12 guy, and in a good matchup, he's going to be even better here because Jamal Williams, what was surprising was that they didn't have to bring him back for Thursday. They could have held him out one more week, but they brought him back, and then Kamara still got all of the inside the 5 work, all the red zone work. I'm really curious of what they're going to do moving forward, if this was just a 1-week thing or if this is how the offense is going to look with the two of them, but nevertheless, love Kamara this week. Tony Pollard comes in at 6. Look, it's been tough sledding for Tony Pollard this season. Has not run efficiently. Has been given some very, very valuable opportunities. I think he leads the league, or maybe he's second. I think he's second to Kenneth Walker inside the 5 carries, but just is not scoring touchdowns. The Rams are not a terrifying matchup. 13th in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season, so in the upper half of the league, but 21st in EPA against the run. So not a bad matchup. And for Pollard's opportunity, he's going to consistently be a top 12 guy for me, especially in neutral to positive matchups. 7, Isaiah Pacheco. Pacheco getting the Denver Broncos, the worst team in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season, and they're the worst team in EPA also against the run. They also give up 6.7 receptions per game to the running back position. Pacheco has still been leading the team in routes run. Jerick McKinnon getting out there a little bit as well, but Pacheco should also be able to contribute in the receiving game this week too in this really plus matchup. At 8 is Saquon Barkley. The Jets are another team that give up a ton of receptions to running backs, 6.8. I think that's the worst in the league, or maybe I think there's one other team that I don't think is playing this week, or I don't have in my top 30 that I think is giving up more, but that is a ton. And Barkley is obviously a guy that has proven to be able to be a very good receiving option, so expect him to be involved there. And it really, with this Jets team and how good they've been against the pass, a lot of teams are looking to run the ball against them. That's why they're 19th in fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. 9, Jahmyr Gibbs. Definitely don't think David Montgomery will be back this week, so that gives Gibbs another opportunity here to get on the field a bunch and lead this team at the running back position. He was second also on the team in routes run. I think he ran 45 routes. He ran more routes than Sam Laporta did against the Ravens in that trailing game script. I'm not surprised he ran a lot of routes. What I am surprised about is that he ran this many, so very, very good sign for him in the receiving game. And then Las Vegas is a good matchup for Detroit to be able to run the ball effectively as well. Gibbs had the only inside the 5 and red zone carry for the team last week. Craig Reynolds didn't take over too much. 25th in fantasy points allowed are the Raiders to running backs this season. 10, this is one of the guys I'm probably highest on compared to consensus this week, Gus Edwards. Cardinals are a fantastic matchup. 30th in fantasy points allowed, 27th in PFF's run defense grade. Obviously for Edwards, not getting the receiving work, that's going to Justice Hill more often than not. He's still running some routes, but he's getting the massive share of the rushing attack. I think Justice Hill had just 4 carries to Edwards' 14, so definitely separating there. And the real advantageous spot is for the rushing attack in a game that I do think the Ravens will handle pretty easily. Justice Hill could still be a viable start for you. He's not in my top 30, but we'll talk about him in a little bit later, that I could still justify playing him if you're in a pinch this week as well. 11, Kenneth Walker. Walker's in for a bit of a tougher matchup this week against the Browns defense. They are falling off a little bit in how they've been against the run, but I think it might be because they are so good against the pass that it's more running the football might be the better way to go. But they're 12th in fantasy points allowed to running back, so no longer in the top 10, but they are first in EPA against the run. So on a down-to-down basis, they still are very good. Walker, though, of course, with the Seattle offense being the focal point for them, and especially with the injuries, with DK Metcalf, we'll see what happens there. But Walker's still going to be a top 12 guy in some down matchups. Some teams I probably wouldn't include him in my top 12, but the Browns aren't quite there yet for me. DeAndre Swift comes in to close out the top 12 backs and RB1s this week. Washington hasn't been as difficult of a matchup as I expected it to be this season. They're 16th in fantasy points allowed, and they're 25th in EPA against the run. So it's not a tough matchup. Swift found the end zone, put up over 80 all-purpose yards in their matchup against Washington a few weeks ago. So still feel confident in him, especially with Kenny Gainwell's role kind of really starting to deteriorate as we've gone forward. Now I move to the top 24. Bijan Robinson is my RB13. I know a very frustrating week last week without having any real information about what was going on and then having him barely touch the field last week. I don't expect that to be the case again this week. I still think Bijan is the number one guy in this offense. So if you can acquire him on the cheap, if any of your league mates are worried, definitely take advantage. Tennessee's a tough matchup though. That's why I don't have him inside my top 12. 14th in fantasy points allowed, 12th in EPA against the run. Haven't quite played like the unit I know that they are, but even this season they haven't given up they haven't given up 100 plus rushing yards in a couple weeks in the last 15, 16 weeks. So it's still a very tough run defense that I do respect. 14 is Raheem Mostert. Jeff Wilson was back, but we didn't really see much of him. He played 7 or 8 snaps. So I'll be interested to see if that changes at all. New England, again, I think if you go off of what they did in that previous matchup earlier in the year, I'm going to be interested to see if they replicate it again here. And that would be really beneficial for Mostert because he ran wild in that game. But the Patriots played 3 high safety sets, very, very light box, and just kind of asked the Dolphins to run the ball. And I thought it was a pretty effective way to play defensively. But again, if the Dolphins go into this game with having the blueprint of what they want to do, or have the blueprint of what the Patriots did in the previous matchup, will the Patriots, go back to that same style? Will be interesting to see. But they've been pretty good against the run. Other than that, just one game that has them 17th in fantasy points allowed. They're 6th in run defense grade, 3rd in EPA against the run. So this is still a really good unit as well. And then we have Raheem Mostert. Following Raheem Mostert, I'm going to actually Carolina with a couple of these backs that are in my top 24, starting with Chuba Hubbard. Hubbard has been played without Miles Sanders a couple weeks ago, and with Sanders dealing with injury, he's been the number one option, and honestly, he's been very good. So I would expect Hubbard to still be the number one guy as we get into this week in a really plus matchup against Houston. 23rd in fantasy points allowed, 31st in PFF's run defense grade. So a good matchup. I definitely expect Carolina to lean on their run game because Houston's actually been very good against the pass so far this year. I would lean towards Hubbard, and right now, again, he's a top 15 guy for me. 16, Deonta Foreman. Foreman getting the Chargers. The Chargers have looked a lot better against the run so far this season. They're 20th in fantasy points allowed, 20th in EPA against the run, and that is saying something for the improvement of this run defense compared to the last couple of years under Brandon Staley. I do think that Foreman, coming off the big week, is still going to get the ball quite a bit, especially if I don't think Fields is going to be back this week. But I do think it's telling that Darrington Evans posted like 14 carries last week. So if Roschon, it's Wednesday morning, I'm recording this, I heard from Matt Eberflus, is expected to practice today. So I think he'll be back this week. I think if Roschon's back, I do think the team likes him more. So I do think it could be a pretty even split here. Maybe Foreman gets a little bit more inside the 5 work, but could see Roschon get more of the receiving work, where the Chargers have given up 6.5 receptions per game to the running back position. So that is quite a bit and could be pretty helpful for him. But again, this is a spot where I do think, as of right now, I think Foreman will probably have a slight edge in the rushing game and potential touchdown opportunities. 17, Derrick Henry. Henry getting the Falcons, and the Falcons have been like the Titans level from last season in terms of run defense. They've been so good. 4th in fantasy points allowed, 1st in run defense grade, 2nd in EPA against the run. But the thing is, we have a Titans team that I think will be without Ryan Tannehill and going between Will Levis and Malik Willis, 2 guys that I do not trust to operate this offense in the passing game, especially with how poor they have been in pass protection. So I think Henry will still get the ball probably 20 plus times in this game because of their inability to throw the football. I don't think he'll be very efficient doing so, but he could potentially, if they find the end zone 1 or 2 times, he could potentially be that guy to score. So I'm still going to keep him inside my top 24, but definitely not feeling great about him heading into this week. 18, Devin Singletary. Houston coming off their bye. I wonder if that has an impact on like Dameon Pierce getting his role back, but when he left and when they went on bye, Singletary was the man, especially in the 4th quarter to close out their most recent game. He was getting the ball far more than Dameon Pierce. So I'm going to go off of that because, again, Pierce has been one of the worst running backs in the league from an efficiency standpoint on the ground. Carolina, a really good matchup. 31st in fantasy points allowed, 32nd in run defense grade, 31st in EPA against the run. They're one of the worst teams against the run this season. And honestly, about as bad as Denver. Denver's just given up more touchdowns. So I think it could be a very good week for Houston's running game. And I think Singletary will have the edge here in touches. So that's why I've got him as the RB 18. 19 is Ramondre Stevenson. Stevenson's getting Miami. I mentioned the matchup for Miami's rushing attack. I think this is still a decent one for New England's rushing attack. Miami is 30th in EPA against the run this year. They've definitely taken a step back compared to last season. I think they can find their groove here, New England, in the rushing game, and as well, Stevenson having the edge in the receiving game here if this is a Patriots team that is trailing in this one, which could definitely be the case against Miami. So I do like Stevenson, still see him as a top 24 guy this week. A guy that's really fallen down my rankings, Josh Jacobs. Jacobs is the RB20, getting Detroit. Detroit's been very good against the run. 3rd in fantasy points allowed, 4th in run defense grade, 11th in EPA. So even off that tough week they had last week, the Ravens didn't run it all that effectively. They killed them in the pass game. Jacobs could get involved as a receiver, obviously, but he hasn't run efficiently regardless of the matchup, so why would I expect him to do so in this one? Still going to get plenty of volume. Still probably see, depending on Jimmy Garoppolo's status, even either way, honestly, we'll probably see between 17 to 20 touches in this game. So in any case, he's still going to be a top 24 guy. 21, Roschon Johnson. Mentioned it earlier, obviously. He is going to have the edge in the receiving game if he is available in this one. If he's not, Foreman will probably move up 2 or 3 spots into my rankings into the top 15. But right now, I think both Foreman and Roschon are viable options for you. 6.5 receptions a game. Again, the Chargers are giving up. Johnson will be the primary receiving back for this team for sure once he's in. And I do think the Bears like him more than they do like Foreman. So there is the off chance he gets more touches in this one as well. 22, Alexander Mattison. A bit tough to include him much higher than this. Obviously, it's a great matchup because the Packers are 28th in fantasy points allowed to running backs and also giving up 6.5 receptions per game as well, along with those what I mentioned about the Chargers. And Madison does have the edge here over Akers in the receiving game, running far more routes. I think he ran 22, I believe, last week in San Francisco. But we saw Akers step in and get more rushing attempts than Madison because Madison has been so brutally inefficient. So I do still think Madison's going to have the edge in carries, opportunities, snaps in this one. So I do still think he's a viable starter, but I can't have him much higher than this, which is telling because it's a very good matchup because Green Bay has really struggled against the run this year. 23, Jonathan Taylor. Taylor and Moss splitting those opportunities. Taylor had a big time bounce back week this past week, but New Orleans is not a matchup that I feel very high about. Second in fantasy points to running backs this season, 7th in EPA against the run. So for Taylor, this isn't one to be too excited about. And again, if he's splitting those opportunities, that's even more of a worry for me. But I do think, again, Indy's going to lean on their ground game in this one against New Orleans with Gardner Minshew at quarterback. So I still think Taylor is someone you could start this week. He's still barely inside my top 24. And the last guy of my RB2s is Dameon Pierce. I do think Singletary has the edge in touches, but I don't think Pierce is going to be completely phased out of this offense. And we have that very, very good matchup against Carolina. So definitely still think he could be a solid start for you despite his struggles. Now we get into our flex options, the guys inside of my top 30, starting with Miles Sanders. I think Miles Sanders will be back this week. And if he's not back, that makes Chuba Hubbard like a top 12 guy for me probably. But in any case, I do expect Sanders to be healthy. I don't expect him to be phased out of this offense. I was trying to read up a little bit on what Frank Reich has been saying about these two guys, and still confidence here in going back to Miles Sanders. He has, but he did say that this is going to be a committee approach, and I do think Hubbard's success and his efficiency so far this season over Sanders gives him the edge, but I do still think Sanders could be a guy you start this week in that flex spot. 26, Joe Mixon. Mixon's still running really inefficiently. The Niners have been very good defensively against the run. They're 8th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. One thing that makes Mixon still an okay start for you, the Niners giving up 5.7 receptions per game to running backs, so definitely some good volume here for Mixon, who's the primary back in all situations for this Bengals team. So that'll elevate him into, a potential decent flex option. Not a very exciting one, but still a decent one. And, obviously can save his week with a touchdown because, again, he has the entire share of this offense in the running back room. 27, James Cook. Cook getting Tampa Bay this week. The one saving grace for him could be, again, Tampa Bay, much like San Francisco, giving up 5.7 receptions per game to the running back position. Cook is capable of being that capable receiver out of the backfield as well. And now that Dawson Knox is out, that could certainly help Cook as well. But Tampa Bay is a team you can't really run the ball all that effectively against. They're 5th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 5th in EPA against the run. So even with giving up those receptions, they're still not giving up many fantasy points. And it's because teams can't really run the ball very efficiently against them. 28. Aaron Jones. I can't believe I'm putting him this far back in my rankings, but man, this Green Bay offense has been absolutely atrocious this season, and Jones is not fully healthy quite yet, so it's really hard to include him much higher than this. Minnesota's a tough matchup, top 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. They blitz a ton, so they're stacking the box quite a bit, and it makes it very difficult to run the ball effectively, and they're not a team giving up a ton of receptions to the running back position either, so it is tough to play Jones, but he is still barely in my rankings because, again, I do trust him at full health to be the number one guy. He's got another week to get healthy here. 29, Rachaad White. Buffalo's not a fantastic run defense. They're 22nd in fantasy points allowed, 18th in EPA against the run as well. But for White, what keeps him inside my top 30, barely inside my top 30, not inside my top 30. He's inside the top 30 because of the matchup with Buffalo isn't too bad. I do think that obviously hasn't run the ball well. We also see a matchup here where they're 8.5-point underdogs. So this is going to be really reliant upon White being involved in the receiving game to elevate his stock here. That is what keeps him inside the top 30 for me. But again, I don't really have a lot of faith in him as big underdogs in this one to be able to be a top 24 guy. But still, viable start because he gets a good amount of touches here too. Closing things out in the top 30, Javonte Williams getting Kansas City. Kansas City 6th in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season. Haven't been fantastic against the run though. We obviously saw Josh Kelly break a big play and score a touchdown. They're 23rd in EPA against the run, 24th in run defense grade. So for Williams, who's looked a lot better the last couple of weeks, I do still think you could play him in this matchup just because, again, of the fact that they are wanting to run the football. He is getting the ball a good amount here, and Kansas City is really the reason they've been so good against running backs is because they've been in so many game scripts where running the football isn't really the way to go. We got a lot of teams in trailing game scripts against them, so utilizing their running backs isn't always the best way to get back into games. So still think Javonte could be a decent play for you. Players that you got to probably be sitting, have just outside of my rankings that I do want to mention for you guys. Kareem Hunt getting Seattle. Seattle's been really good against the run. They've given up some touchdowns to the position, but from an efficiency standpoint, been really, really tough. I know Hunt is going to be playing without Jerome Ford. Pierre Strong will be the backup. I still think this is too tough of a matchup. I don't want to start him when I look at some of these great options that are ahead of him. Najee Harris and Jalen Warren getting Jacksonville. Jacksonville's given up a lot of receptions to running backs, so we could see Jalen Warren benefit from that, but they've been a stout run defense all season long, so I do not want to start Harris. I don't have faith in him as from that efficiency standpoint. And when you're getting a bad matchup, he is just a for sure stay away. Cam Akers is outside, is like my RB 37 on the week. Brian Robinson, definitely not going to be starting him against the Eagles. The Eagles are the best run defense in the league. I think they're number one in fantasy points allowed to running backs too. And Robinson in bad matchups is just a nightmare with this offensive line. Darrell Henderson, again, I know he has the lion's share of the opportunities here for Los Angeles, but again, this is another case of matchup not being quite good enough. Dallas is one of the best, again, top 7, 8, I think, in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So I'm not going to trust this Rams team to be able to run the ball effectively. Henderson's going to be splitting opportunities with Royce Freeman as well, so don't feel great about him. Other guys outside my top 36, A.J. Dillon's my RB 31, and then I also have Zach Moss and Justice Hill just outside. I mentioned again that Hill could be someone you start. Moss, again, starting to lose his role a little bit, and it's a tough matchup against New Orleans. So those are some of the guys I'm definitely not starting this week. I could see you wanting to start Kareem Hunt just because he could get some decent volume, but again, I don't love the matchup, and the rest of these guys are just bad matchups, and I just don't see enough opportunity for them either. But if there's any guys I missed that you want to hear about, definitely drop those down below in the comments. Happy to answer those down below as well. Again, go check out the Stunt. Follow us on there, OwnersBox on the Stunt. 4 to 5 Eastern, we're hosting a live room there to answer all of your fantasy football questions. That link will be down below to download. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next one.